My premise is that anything is possible in America. And what Democratic Senator Chris Dodd of Connecticut said when we passed the Help America Vote Act in 2002 was the goal of this bipartisan legislation is to do two things that we can accomplish at the same time. We can make it easy to vote, and we can make it hard to cheat. We can do both. And I submit to you that people of goodwill, people who wish government to operate better, do not have to engage in polarizing partisan debates over this. We can do both. One of the saddest things that I have noticed is that rather than argue about this issue, we can have a solution to this problem. Andrew Young, the former mayor of Atlanta, the former UN ambassador, the former confidant of Martin Luther King, told me, well, of course everyone in America should have an ID. You can't be part of the mainstream of American life. You can't collect Social Security. You can't collect benefits. You can't cash a check. You can't travel. You can't enter a federal building. You can't marry, gay or otherwise. You can't do anything in this life without an ID. So if there are a few people, and it's far fewer than the 10% of the population Brennan Center discovered in the flawed telephone poll, and it's far fewer than 25% of African Americans they preposterously claim lack an ID. How patronizing to say that 25% of African Americans can't obtain an ID. It is far fewer than that. So let's go about the business of getting everyone a free ID. Let's do it. And I hope the enabling legislation behind this amendment, which will of course be debated and passed next year, has a tremendous outreach effort, including what Georgia did. Andrew Young praised Georgia for sending mobile vans out to rural communities and to senior citizen centers and getting people the ID that they needed. I estimate that the groups fighting voter ID, given their publicity costs and their legal bills and everything, have spent well over $10 million nationwide on this effort. Probably a lot. If they spent a small portion of that, combining with other people of goodwill and getting people an ID, we could solve the problem. And there would be a debate. But instead of finding a solution, we have this unfortunate debate. Now, there is no voter fraud. Well, moving from the national to Minnesota, it's very easy to commit fraud that you'll never detect. The Pew Research Center, an impeccably nonpartisan group, estimates there are between 1.8 million and 2 million dead people on our voter rolls. Now look, I think we should honor our dead, but I do not believe in representation without respiration. If you can find the name of a dead person on a voter registration list, and you go in and vote in their name, by the way, they never check the signature, never. If you can vote in their name, what do you think the odds are that dead person will complain about it? Very small, I would suspect, unless there's a resurrection. Well, that can happen. To show you how easy it is to vote in the name of someone else, a 22-year-old white punk kid with an earring and a beard, who didn't look anything like Eric Holder, our Attorney General, walked into his polling place where he'd been a voter for 32 years in Washington, D.C. and said, "Do you have an Eric Holder at such and such an address?" Didn't even say it was Eric Holder. He was handed his ballot. He didn't vote it because it would have been a crime. It just shows you how easy that can happen. The headlines every day bring up problems. Today, the Democratic nominee for a Maryland congressional seat had to resign her position because she had voted in 2 states twice. Twice! She voted in Florida and Maryland. She said it was an accident. Arkansas, Bill Clinton lambasted attempts to improve ballot integrity last week in his speech at the Democratic National Convention. 2.5 hours before he mounted the podium in his native Arkansas, a Democratic state legislator, a West Memphis city councilman, and a police official in West Memphis, Arkansas, pled guilty to voter fraud. 45 counts. Rhode Island. Last year, Debbie Wasserman Schultz and Bill Clinton said that voter ID was the functional equivalent of the Jim Crow return of poll taxes. Days before they spoke, they should have gone to Rhode Island, where a Democratic legislature, 8-1 Democratic, had passed a photo ID bill. The sponsor was State Senator Harold Metz, the only African American in that body, a Democrat. The sponsor in the House was the only African American speaker of the House that state has ever seen, Gideon Fox. They sent it to Lincoln Chafee, that noted conservative who has left the Republican Party, and he signed it into law because he said, I met with community groups from Providence, Rhode Island, and they said, we have a voter fraud problem and photo ID will address it. We have non-citizens who will vote. An NBC affiliate in Fort Myers, Florida, went through the court records, and they found hundreds of people who said, we can't serve on a jury because we're non-citizens. And many of them had registered to vote, and many of them had voted. We have a potential problem here. Arthur Davis, the former Democratic congressman from Alabama who seconded Barack Obama's nomination for president at the Denver convention, who was the first Democratic congressman outside of Illinois to endorse Barack Obama for president in 2008, said, I can no longer oppose voter ID because there are counties in my district, which includes Selma, the home of the Voting Rights Museum. There are counties in my district where corrupt political machines, both black and white, keep people down. These are places with bad public schools, bad roads, bad services. When reformers of both races, of all races, try to get together to fight City Hall will steal the votes. Greene County, Alabama, a perfect example. I can no longer defend the real voter suppression in this country, Arthur Davis said. The real voter suppression in this country is when people try to fight City Hall, they can't, and their votes are stolen from them, and the machine stays in place and continues to deliver bad public services. Detroit, Kwame Kilpatrick, the corrupt mayor of Detroit, is on trial this week. He could have been out of office years ago, but he ran for re-election and he won because of absentee ballot fraud. The registrar of the city of Detroit had to be removed from office by the state of Michigan because of that fraud. We could have defeated him with a reform candidate years ago. Now to Minnesota. Of course there is no voter fraud in Minnesota. Of course there isn't. State Government Elections Committee of the Legislature, February 2012. Testimony from an election judge in Ramsey County. Over 100 vouched for voters used the same utility bill for proof of residence. Your vouching system is an interesting one. It's not unheard of. There can be vouching bills. Canada, to the north, that great repository of racism and fascism, did you know that it has a national voter ID law? You can vouch for someone. You can vouch for one person, not 15, which is what Minnesota does. We have the case in the Secretary of State's office. Olaribi George, also known as Victoria Ayula. She committed voter fraud. She registered to vote and voted under a false name. She worked for the Secretary of State's office. Secretary of State Ritchie, to his credit, wrote the following. This office has provided information to the Washington County Attorney regarding Ms. George using her false government-issued driver's license to vote and register to vote, which would be additional felony violations of state law, unquote. Kudos to Secretary of State Ritchie. The statute of limitations had lapsed, so of course he was not charged. 1,100 felons did vote illegally. That's called fraud in the 2008 election. If it's not fraud, what would you call it? It's voting improperly and illegally, fraudulently. Now, Minnesota law requires intent, prove intent to convict someone. So if you say in Minnesota, I'm a felon, I didn't know, I forgot, I didn't know my rights weren't restored, you're not going to be prosecuted. You basically can only be prosecuted if you confess. You can prove intent. Well, out of the 1,100, we're closing in just a few short of 200 who have been convicted of voter fraud. By the way, the penalty, $50 vote. Do you think that's enough for voter fraud? I don't. I know places in Kentucky, Republican counties in Kentucky, because this is bipartisan, where $50 and a fifth of bourbon is the price of a vote. This isn't even up to the cost of the vote that people sometimes buy. Now, there are other troubling things in Minnesota law. In 2008, the election of Al Franken was decided by 312 votes after the seat was vacated for 8 months. And of course, there was a tremendous legal battle. 6,224 same-day, election day registrations were returned as undeliverable. People had filled out an address when they registered to vote. The address came back within days. No such address. Now, I don't know why that happens, but I can suspect that some people didn't put down the right address. Some people may have put down a fake address. Some of the addresses were vacant lots. Some of them were Taco Bells. Now, 2,758 of those were Hennepin County. I think they should have been looked at. I don't know who should have looked at them, but I think that would have been something of concern. Because the election was decided by 312 votes, and it determined whether one party would have a filibuster-proof majority in the United States Senate. There are problems in our election system. We can do both things. We can make it easy to vote, and we can make it hard to cheat. Let's get everyone an ID. Let's have a massive outreach effort. Let's spend some money. I don't think there are very many people without an ID, unless they live in caves or off the grid. But if there are people, let's get them an ID. And by the way, if you vote absentee, you don't need an ID. But I do think we can improve the absentee ballot laws as well by having people put down the last 5 digits of their social security number. Everyone basically has one or both of those. Bottom line, we have 2 civil rights in this country. The first civil right is to make sure that no one is prevented from voting. I do not believe in exclusion. I agree with the district attorney. I agree. We fought a great civil rights struggle in the 1960s to make sure that poll taxes, literacy tests, intimidation, fear did not prevent people from voting. We need to preserve and extend those gains. But there's a second civil right that each and every one of you have when it comes to voting. It is the right not to have your vote canceled out, to be disenfranchised because someone is voting who's illegal, not a citizen, a felon who hasn't had their rights restored, is dead, who comes from out of state for the day. That disenfranchises you as much as if someone stands in the polling place door and says you can't come in here. We can do both. We can make sure people vote, and everyone should vote, and we can make sure that the confidence of our election system is preserved. The Supreme Court decision upholding the constitutionality of voter ID was written by John Paul Stevens, the most liberal member of the court at the time. And as the 7th Circuit Court of Appeals, which sent that case up to the Supreme Court, ruled, much of voter fraud can never be detected. It is like an iceberg. 1/10 above the surface, 9/10 below the surface. Let's not take a risk that there's a lot more fraud happening than even we realize, that even these headlines indicate. Let's take a sensible, good government approach, making it easy to vote and hard to cheat. Thank you.